Hey, welcome back. I'm Melody, which is something I don't say very often, admittedly, but remains true nonetheless. And today, as you probably saw, we are here to talk about the exponential rise in book bans yet again. We talked about this less than a year ago. So if you haven't seen that discussion, I will link it, and I'm sure I will still touch on a lot of the pertinent points. But there has been, unfortunately, a lot of development even since last year. And last year I talked about kind of the atmosphere feeling different, there being such an exponential rise in book bans and challenges, as I had said, this idea of Banned Books Week, which we are not currently in, but next week is National Library Week, and we will be getting a list of the most contested titles from 2022, which I may react to. Let me know if there's any interest there. But I think there's going to be some challenge with that as well, based on the data that the American Library Association has already released, that one kind of vindicates this feeling of a shift, especially from 2020 to 2021 and then 2022. In 2020, the American Library Association reports 223 direct challenges to independent titles. Now, again, as we discussed the first time, a lot of challenges go unreported, and there is a lot of this happening in darkness, so it is not a complete picture, but it is still a starting point and a picture of some sort. And so I talked about personally how Banned Book Week was always something that was observed, but it always felt like a little bit of a given. It was like, yeah, banning books is bad. And even growing up, there were of course efforts to ban things or contest things, but it was almost kind of laughed at in some ways, and not in a way to discredit it, but in a way that we acknowledged that those were extreme measures. And to be fair, I think that there is still this acknowledgement and this public perception, and so I think that this drastic increase and how they've been approaching it, which we will talk about, it's really flying in the face of what the public wants. I believe the report I saw showed 71% against the banning of books, essentially. Now, that is a concerning number because that means there are 29% that are for the banning of books. Now, granted, I don't know exactly where these numbers came from, how big the sample size was, what the kind of data feeding into this was. So with any data, there are those variables you have to consider. And I understand not being in support of every piece of material in a library. For instance, I don't like Ann Coulter books. I think they perpetuate hate and perpetuate othering of groups that leads to violence and to extreme measures. That doesn't mean that no one has the right to access those books because I don't agree with them. However, a lot of the legislation we are seeing presented in tandem with these challenges is proposing that. And to be fair and to be clear, a lot of this legislation that states across the country are trying to sneak through in different ways is being forwarded by extremist groups. This is, again, not the popular sentiment. However, when I use the word sneak, that is a very important word because that is often what is happening. And we are using this very broad, vague language. And that legislation directly ties back to the American Library Association's numbers that they've released for 2022, or the data that we have so far, which not only reports this drastic increase in challenges, this escalation that we can definitely feel from 2020 to 2021, but then again in a very dramatic and drastic way from 2021 to 2022, in a way that I was kind of positing and hypothesizing last year, and I feared on some level that I was being hyperbolic, but I was trying to be safe rather than sorry. And we had heard stories from creators like Bookish Realm, who is a librarian, and other librarian creators about how the kind of tone, how a lot of the legislative precedent that was being set was making it very dangerous for librarians in a lot of places. So we were seeing these rumblings, and obviously the conversations around book banning have picked up drastically. We're now at the point where People is releasing a press release about a celebrity initiative to raise awareness around book banning. What this actually does and how much awareness will be raised, I don't know. I hope there is direct action that they will be talking about and inspiring, because I am here obviously talking and just raising awareness, which I recognize isn't enough in and of itself. And I had a little bit of trouble with that article for a slight tangent, because I'm seeing this kind of impetus or this instinct to talk about classics in relation to book banning, like The Bluest Eye and To Kill a Mockingbird, which are incredibly important narratives and should be protected at all costs. But we are often ignoring the current titles that are being challenged and banned and taken from classrooms, taken from libraries. And we're not completely ignoring it, to be fair and to be clear. But I think especially in these larger initiatives, there is this instinct to go for classic titles or to talk about classic titles, to forward classic titles in the discourse, because there is this level of protection that we as a society have already agreed about the importance and the impact of those titles. It is harder to counter why we should ban The Diary of Anne Frank, though it has been proposed. And so I understand on some level, but it is taking away the very real, present, and escalating danger for a lot of contemporary authors that are being approached in public sometimes. I saw a TikTok from All Boys Aren't Blue author George M. Johnson, which is a fabulous book and also one of the most contested in the country anecdotally, and I believe last year. We will see what the 2022 numbers and data and report shows, but I would not be surprised to see it listed and expect to see it there, honestly. And it is a gorgeous book. I've read it with my book club even, but they told a story of how a man was harassing them in an airport, attempting to confront them about the perceived inappropriateness of their book, would not stop following them and attempting to instigate, attempting to escalate to confrontation, to physicality. And we've seen this kind of physical intimidation spread throughout the country, even at libraries. And so we are seeing this escalate beyond the theoretical. And I want to be clear that it's never theoretical when banning books, especially when we have predominantly seen these challenges targeting books from the LGBTQIA+ experience and from experiences exploring racial diversity and especially the Black experience, and even more specifically racism, and books that engage with the history of racism in America. And so we've seen this escalation. We see this shown in the American Library Association numbers. And what the American Library Association data is also telling us is that 90% of these contests and bans were in attempts to ban multiple titles, which ties back to these extremist groups that are forwarding this legislation across the country. And so we've got this kind of boilerplate legislation and this list of books that is supposedly inappropriate for schools and public libraries, but I think that most of us know what that coding means. So now we're in an environment where Republicans in Missouri are voting to defund public libraries. Now listen, the last Gilded Age, we got an expansion of public libraries. And I say the last Gilded Age because if you've been here a second, you know I've kind of sprinkled throughout my kind of anecdotal theory that we really are in another Gilded Age of sorts with this kind of large disparity in wealth. And while I have kind of jokingly said the least they could do is bring back monocles, even more importantly is I grew up around Carnegie libraries. And recently those libraries that I grew up in and have taken so much pride in terms of their history and their connection to the history of public libraries in America, have been directly threatened by legislation in Indiana, book banning legislation in Indiana. And you may have seen me post this on my community tab a week or so ago now, where there was kind of a last minute amendment that took verbiage from Senate Bill 12, I believe, and Senate Bill 12 aimed to make it a felony for teachers or school librarians to have material that was deemed inappropriate. The thing is, anyone could deem that material inappropriate. And you might be saying, well, Melody, there is a process, so there would be a back and forth. You could vet the material, you could make a case for the material. It's not going to be taken out immediately or forever, I should say. And I say to that, the goal of this legislation is to control teachers and librarians within schools through this fear, through this hanging over their head. And I want to be clear, as the daughter and family member of many educators in Indiana, Indiana is already awful to its teachers. And so if you are forwarding this legislation where anyone could conceivably deem anything inappropriate at any time, you are actively you are promoting self-censorship. So it's just as much about getting teachers and librarians to second guess what they're bringing in as resources as to actively fight against what already may be in a collection or in a classroom. And so then we're weaponizing worldview. I wish Governor Holcomb would talk as passionately about the First Amendment as he pandered to the NRA recently. Now, I know I am talking talking very specifically about Indiana here, but that's because it's the state I'm closest to, both, physically and having grown up there. And speaking of growing up there, I was clued into this legislation from a high school friend who now runs the public library. And you might be saying, Melody, why was she bringing up this legislation when it was aimed at school libraries? Well, one, we love when librarians support other librarians and educators, especially in a small community like I grew up in. However, she also rightfully anticipated that Indiana can be very sneaky in its legislation, and while the legislation was focused only on schools at the time, it easily could have been changed last minute to include public libraries, which is exactly what happened. This bill wasn't super popular, gratefully. However, that wasn't enough to stop them. They tried to take the language of this bill, add in public libraries, and sneak it onto an amendment of another bill. And I do say sneak because that community post went up after hours one day after I had seen her post about this, and they were presumably discussing it the very next day. Luckily, we were able to spread the word quickly enough that librarians were able to speak at the State House. However, when I posted that, because I posted it to basically every social media I have, I had a friend who is a librarian in Northwest Indiana who hadn't even heard of the development yet, because that's how quickly they were trying to push this through. Now, it did not work. It failed, like I said, which is amazing, and we need to celebrate that. However, I don't trust them anymore. They are going to try and sneak this through again. They've done it once, they're going to do it again, and we need to keep our eyes out. And what makes me even more frustrated is we have a quote from a Republican, and I'm going to name names. This is from the Northwest Indiana Times. I will do my best to remember to link it. But the legislation, specifically forwarded by Republicans, because that's just the fact of the matter, was really focusing on this emphasis that there is pornographic, inappropriate materials in schools and public libraries for children. Despite the fact that, one, as my library friend in Indiana pointed out, there are already obscenity laws on the books in Indiana directly related to this, or to prevent inappropriate pornographic materials from circulating, what have you. Whatever the measure of that is, I haven't looked at the law in a while. Additionally, libraries already have a process for patrons to kind of challenge materials, or to talk with the director about the appropriateness of certain materials, or what have you. Despite the fact that if you don't like it, don't check it out. If it's not checked out enough, it will eventually get weeded. If it's not serving the community, it won't stay there forever. And if it is still there, despite the fact that it is not being checked out regularly, there is probably a very specific reason why that material is in the collection, and librarians study curation for a reason. And I have nothing but respect for the challenges in keeping a living collection growing and thriving, especially amidst budgets, and challenging limited budgets at that. But going back to this legislation momentarily, because I want to talk about this quote from a state senator in Indiana, and tone interpretation is completely me because I didn't try to find any live proceedings at any of this. But it says, "We're talking about really, really bad books," said Senator Jim Tomes, R. Wadesville. "It's so disgusting that I couldn't even bring myself to open it up." They haven't even read the books. They're looking at a blanket list that they have been fed. They are using wording and verbiage that they have been fed, and they can't even use it accurately here. They can't even make a case. They are falling into this almost virtue signaling of, oh, it's bad, and we're protecting people. But no, you are forwarding your own worldview and trying to make it so no one else can think differently, or you don't have to encounter anything that makes you personally uncomfortable. And when I came across this quote the first time, I joked with this friend that it has big, like, oh, I totally did the reading energy, which honestly makes me angrier, because these are politicians that we are voting in and expecting to have a level of respect to the consideration of the thing. And they are not considering, they are not actively engaging with this legislation. They are not doing their research. And honestly, that quote comes across incredibly stupid. And I try not to be that blunt and mean, but when you have a responsibility to your constituents and you're not even doing the bare minimum, and the bare minimum that you can't even disguise amidst like clever wordplay, and it's not about like speaking to your audience in any way here, or about like talking to your constituents, it just sounds incredibly uneducated. And how are we supposed to have any confidence in our lawmakers when they aren't, like I said, actively researching, actively engaging, and they're just spewing out bullshit like this? But it's not about being educated on the issue for them, it's about forcing through and sneaking through that legislation. And so we're seeing this really concerning uptick nationally. And we do need to be actively talking about it, even if actively talking about it in and of itself isn't the be-all, end-all of the action. However, how are we actively talking about it? For instance, there was an NPR article that was making the rounds recently because it didn't really engage with the danger of these precedents we're seeing set and forwarded in book challenges and bans, and the fact that we can use bans a lot more definitively after this past year than we've really been able to in the past. And that article, one, gave voice to the extremist point of view, which from a journalistic angle, I unfortunately can understand in the sense of trying to give the impression of a fair and balanced report. However, I would argue that this article wasn't fair and balanced at all because it seemed to be written with the understanding that book banning is bad in a way that I don't think we can take for granted in our discussion, our kind of wide discussion of it anymore, because we are seeing so much escalation of this. And it wasn't pulling in experts in combating book banning or kind of initiatives to fight this. Rather, it was kind of talking about the guerrilla initiatives that have sprung up since this increase in book bans. And we talked about this a little bit last year. This idea that was being circulated, especially as we started to see these mass lists coming out of Texas and Florida, that this is actually good for sales and that actually this is going to make students seek out these titles even more. And we saw some famous authors forwarding this point of view. But this point of view, like I said last year, is wrong in a lot of ways. We have these mass lists. One, by taking these books out of schools and libraries, period, those children, those students no longer have access to those titles. And yes, they can find them other places. The NPR article had this weird bit where it made sure to point out that a lot of these books can be found pirated online, actually, so they're not completely inaccessible. Because I guess one controversial topic wasn't enough, these authors are being hurt by these bans. And to play with that internet idea a little further for a moment, because I do see a lot of discussion of, well, these things are online anyway. Even in the article about these measures failing in Indiana, that was a main point that was brought up. And that has always kind of made me nervous because I'm like, if they're willing to ban books, they're not gonna stop there. And I've grown up with the internet. We have a largely unregulated space for good or for ill sometimes. However, in this legislation that we've seen recently, and again, I am no legal scholar, I'm no political scholar, so this is all my observation and anecdotes. However, I am kind of alarmed by how much of what I posited last year or was worried about last year we've seen come to fruition this year. So I'm not claiming any expertise or like foreknowledge, but just it seems like a logical conclusion in my brain. So we're seeing this legislation against TikTok, right? Whatever your opinions on TikTok are, but it's being wrapped up as national security, which seems like a good thing, right? In the same way like protecting children is a good thing. We want to protect them, but from what? And so the broadness of the legislation aiming to ban TikTok is what concerns me, because if we're using it for this danger, what is stopping them from claiming something else they don't like is a danger down the road? And like I said, right now there's a real vagueness to this language, and vagueness can be weaponized. But to go back to these kind of guerrilla efforts talked about in this NPR article again, we have this idea of building up little free libraries with banned titles, or giving out and distributing banned books to students, which are all, as I mentioned last year, a great instinct. They are movements and action that come from a good place, but they are being presented in this NPR article as a kind of larger action than they really are, even if I do think it talks about it in the article as being a kind of band-aid, but these actions can't exist on their own. In the same way that I read a Book Riot article recently that was kind of giving resources about taking action against book bans and kind of directly calling out this celebrity-driven Let America Read campaign, because what is the action behind that? There has to be that next step. Get the visibility out, but what are we doing after we get that visibility? How are we encouraging people to show up for their libraries outside of that crisis moment? I am so incredibly grateful that so many people showed up for Indiana libraries at that crisis moment, but how do we as everyday patrons help before we get to that point? And the action items remain largely the same as last year. First and foremost, utilize your library card, especially in smaller communities. Showing that demand, proving circulation can help allocate resources to your community to help serve your community as the libraries are doing. And as we talked about before, to actively check out books that are being challenged, that are being banned, not only to be able to interact with that work and that text, but to illustrate demand for that title and to keep it active within the system. And then it's available for other people to discover, people who may need it desperately. On top of just using your library, which is the most basic but never to be discounted, requesting books that maybe aren't in your collection but you've seen and would like access to, especially again if they are being challenged or banned, that increases circulation, proves more utilization, this, that, and the other, and then you are actively engaging with more titles. But more importantly, again, especially in smaller communities where the budget is a little tighter, you are proving a demand, and if a demand can be proven, you're more likely to bring those types of materials in because then it is serving the population, it's serving the community. In terms of continuing to emphasize the importance of utilizing your library, if your library has programs and events, show up for them. If your library has a Friends of the Library program, work with them, volunteer for them, ask what they need, donate to your library where you have the means, because again, those budgets are often very thin and that can go a long way. Pay attention to local elections that could impact libraries, pay attention to the platforms of local politicians and engage at a local level. It is incredibly important. Speak up at library meetings if they are open to the public or any kind of community public meetings where the library is up for discussion, especially if it is related to book bans. Make your voice heard because we take for granted conflict is uncomfortable. We talked about that last time too, but we take for granted, especially at this moment, that book bans are bad. They are, absolutely. But we have to fight for these titles, these authors, these perspectives with the fervor that people are fighting against them. And the fact that we are targeting these public servants that are doing everything they can to build up a better, more vibrant, supported society and community. The fact that these titles build up a more empathetic, aware, vibrant community. But I'm preaching to the choir. I'm gonna get off the soapbox. This is where we're kind of sitting with the state of book banning right now. We will get, like I said, next week a list of the top contested titles from last year. Let me know if you're interested in going through that, though I of course can't promise I have read every title that will be on that list. The odds are great that I probably haven't. But in the meantime, let's all make sure to keep our eyes open. We have seen a drastic, concerning rise. We are seeing a lot of things in motion that we were worried were going to escalate last year that have escalated. So let's keep our feet on the ground, let's support our libraries, and let's take every action we can to continue to support books, support authors, support libraries. Librarians, if you have other points, other action items, as always, please leave those below. Thank you all for hanging out and listening to my thoughts here. Like and subscribe if you feel like it. Read something good, maybe a title that's been contested a lot, but yeah, bye.